China consumes more iron ore than the rest of the planet combined, around 1.1 billion tons a year, give or take a port strike, almost all of it melted down to build the apartments, bridges, and electric vehicles that define the modern Chinese economy. And yet, if you trace that supply chain backwards from a steel mill in Hebei province, past the bulk carriers in the East China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, you do not end up in a glittering megaport. You end up in a small, windblown patch of red dirt in the Pilbara Desert, about 1,500 kilometers north of Perth, where the temperature regularly hits 45 degrees and the nearest decent coffee is a 2-hour drive away. This is Port Hedland, population around 15,000, and in a single financial year, it moved 538 million tons of iron ore through its harbor, making it the largest bulk export terminal on Earth by tonnage. Not the biggest container port, not the busiest passenger terminal, the single largest tonnage port on the planet, sitting in a town smaller than most outer suburbs. The mechanism behind that fact is stranger than it looks. It explains something about how the Chinese economy actually works that you will not find in any official statement from Beijing. Keep an eye out for a 2021 Reserve Bank of Australia bulletin near the end of this. It quietly admits something that most commentators still refuse to say out loud. The story starts in 1965 when a geologist named Stan Hilditch was poking around a flat-topped hill called Mount Whaleback in the eastern Pilbara. What he found was not a vein, it was not a deposit in the traditional sense, it was a mountain that was essentially made of iron. Grades above 64%, which in mining terms is the geological equivalent of opening a bottle and finding it pre-filled with whiskey. Within a decade, BHP had built a railway, a town called Newman, and a port facility at Port Hedland to ship the stuff out. Rio Tinto did the same thing further west. At Dampier, Fortescue, the upstart founded by Andrew Forrest, joined the party in the mid-2000s and built its own loading terminal right next to BHP's at Port Hedland. By 2010, 3 companies were running what is effectively a private 1,700-kilometer railway network across the desert, feeding ore into one shared choke point on the coast. The Pilbara now produces roughly 38% of all seaborne iron ore on the global market, according to Geoscience Australia's 2023 Commodity Review. For comparison, Brazil's entire iron ore export industry, Vale included, sits at around 23%. One Australian state outproduces an entire continent, but here is where the obvious story stops making sense. Iron ore is not rare. It is the 4th most abundant element in the Earth's crust. China itself has enormous domestic reserves. So why does a country with the largest steel industry in human history rely on a desert port in Western Australia for the majority of its raw material? The answer is not geology. It is grade, cost, and a quiet decision made in Beijing in the early 2000s that almost nobody outside the industry talks about. Chinese domestic iron ore averages around 20 to 30% iron content. Pilbara ore averages 58 to 62%. To produce 1 ton of steel using Chinese ore, a mill has to dig up, crush, and process roughly 3 times more rock, burn more coking coal, and emit significantly more carbon than if it just bought Australian. Researchers at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU calculated in a 2019 working paper that switching from Pilbara ore to domestic Chinese ore would raise the energy cost of Chinese steel production by somewhere between 18 and 24%. At the volumes China operates at, that is not a rounding error. That is the difference between profitable apartment construction and a property sector that collapses faster than it already is. So in 2003, as China's steel demand began its parabolic climb, the State Council quietly directed major state-owned mills, Baowu and Steel, Shugang, to prioritize imports of high-grade ore over domestic supply. The decision was framed as environmental, it was, in reality, economic, and the country best positioned to supply that ore at scale, at grade, and at a price low enough to make the math work was Australia. Specifically, 3 companies operating out of one harbor in a town most Australians have never visited. By 2013, Port Hedland was shipping over 370 million tons a year. By 2020, that number had climbed past 530 million. In a single month, August 2023, the port handled 46.8 million tons, which according to the Pilbara Ports Authority is more tonnage than the Port of Los Angeles handles in an entire year across all commodities combined, and yet the town itself looks like a slightly upgraded caravan park, which raises the obvious question. Where does all the money go? The answer is not where you might expect. In the 2022-23 financial year, Western Australia collected approximately $9.4 billion Australian dollars in iron ore royalties, according to the WA Department of Treasury's annual report. That is roughly a quarter of the entire state budget, funded by one commodity flowing through one port. BHP's iron ore division alone reported underlying earnings of $18.3 billion that same year, more than the combined profits of Qantas, Telstra, Woolworths, and Coles. Rio Tinto's Pilbara operations generated $17.1 billion in underlying earnings. Fortescue posted $5.5 billion. The combined iron ore profits of three companies operating out of the Pilbara exceeded the total market capitalization of most ASX-listed industries. And the kicker is that the marginal cost of producing a ton of Pilbara ore, the actual cost to dig it up and ship it, sits at around $18 per ton for the majors. The price they sell it for fluctuates between $90 and $140. That is a margin that would make a Colombian cartel jealous. But the strangeness deepens when you look at who actually keeps that money. BHP is headquartered in Melbourne but listed on both the ASX and the LSE, with major institutional shareholders in the United States and the United Kingdom. Rio Tinto is dual listed in London and Sydney. Fortescue is the only one with a majority Australian shareholding, largely because Andrew Forrest still owns about 36% of it personally. The result is that the wealth generated by Chinese demand, channeled through an Australian port, accrues largely to pension funds in Boston, sovereign wealth funds in Norway, and one man with a cattle station the size of Belgium. The town of Port Hedland itself, meanwhile, has a median house price of around $520,000, a workforce that is roughly 60% fly in, fly out, and a council that has spent the last decade arguing with the port operators about red dust contamination in residential areas. The wealthiest tonnage port on Earth has a main street with 3 pubs and a Woolworths. If this story is making you uncomfortable in the way that all good supply chain stories should, this is the part where the geopolitical layer kicks in. Because China is acutely aware of how exposed it is. In 2010, after Australia detained a Rio Tinto executive named Stern Hu on charges of bribery, Beijing began a quiet but sustained effort to diversify away from Pilbara ore. The flagship project is Simandou, a massive iron ore deposit in the Republic of Guinea in West Africa, where Chinese state-owned enterprises. Rio Tinto are jointly developing what could become the largest greenfield iron ore mine in history. First shipments are scheduled for late 2025. The grade is comparable to the Pilbara, around 65% iron, and the projected output is around 120 million tons per year at full capacity. On paper, Simandou is supposed to break the Pilbara's stranglehold. In practice, the math does not quite work. Even at full production, Simandou would supply roughly 10% of China's current import demand. The shipping distance from Guinea to China is more than double the distance from Port Hedland, which adds significant cost. And the political stability of Guinea is charitably a work in progress, with 2 coups since 2008. Meanwhile, BHP, Rio, and Fortescue are not standing still. They have collectively invested over $30 billion Australian dollars in expansion projects since 2018, including autonomous trains, driverless trucks, and at Rio Tinto's Gudai-Darri mine, an almost entirely automated operation that runs with a fraction of the human workforce of older mines. The result is that the Pilbara is getting cheaper to operate, not more expensive, even as labor costs in the rest of Australia balloon. Which brings us to the mechanism the Reserve Bank of Australia quietly described in its September 2021 bulletin on commodity exports, and which most commentators still talk around rather than through. The RBA's analysis, authored by economists in the Economic Analysis Department, made a point that is almost embarrassing in its bluntness. The Australian iron ore industry is not just a beneficiary of Chinese demand, It is structurally embedded in the Chinese economy in a way that makes the two effectively codependent. When Chinese steel mills need ore, they cannot simply switch suppliers without absorbing a cost increase that would ripple through every construction project in the country. When Australian miners need buyers, they cannot replace Chinese demand because no other economy consumes steel at that volume. The two sides have spent 20 years building an infrastructure of contracts, shipping routes, financial settlements, and physical port capacity that locks them together. And the choke point of that entire arrangement, the single physical location where the relationship is most concentrated, is Port Hedland. The bulletin notes that during the diplomatic freeze of 2020 and 2021, when China imposed punitive tariffs on Australian wine, barley, coal, and lobster iron ore was conspicuously left untouched, not because Beijing forgot, because it could not afford to. Chinese steel mills were running at near full capacity to support the post-COVID construction stimulus. Any disruption to Pilbara supply would have driven the global iron ore price up faster than any tariff could compensate for. The RBA's conclusion, stated carefully in the dry register of central bank prose, is that Port Hedland functions as something close to a strategic asset for both countries simultaneously. It is the physical hinge on which a trillion-dollar bilateral relationship rotates, and it is operated by 3 private companies in a town of 15,000 people with a council that mostly worries about dust. The mechanism is this: the Chinese economy does not just buy Australian iron ore. It is built on it, brick by brick, beam by beam, apartment by apartment. And the entire arrangement passes through a harbor most Chinese citizens have never heard of, in a country they may never visit, exporting more weight per year than any other port on Earth. One desert town, one commodity, one trade relationship that neither side can walk away from without breaking something they both need. What you have just seen is not a story about mining. It is a story about how dependency gets built quietly over decades, through infrastructure decisions that look mundane at the time and become irreversible by the time anyone notices. Port Hedland is not unique in its function. It is unique in its scale. Every major economy has a choke point like this somewhere, a single facility or town, a stretch of coastline that holds disproportionate leverage over a much larger system, and most of them are equally invisible to the people who depend on them. The interesting question is not whether China will diversify away from the Pilbara, it is whether the Pilbara could survive if China ever truly succeeded, because the next time you hear someone talk about Australian sovereignty over its resources, it is worth asking who actually owns the mines, where the profits actually flow, what happens to a town of 15,000 inches of the desert when the customer on the other end of the railway finally finds another supplier. And to understand why that question matters, you have to look at who actually sits behind the corporate logos painted on those ore carriers. Rio Tinto, the largest single exporter through Port Hedland's broader Pilbara network, is headquartered in London and Melbourne, with its largest shareholder being Chinalco, a Chinese state-owned enterprise that quietly acquired a 14.99% stake in 2008 during the financial crisis. BHP, the other giant, is dominated by institutional investors spread across New York, London, and Singapore. Fortescue Metals Group, founded by Andrew Forrest in 2003, is the only one of the big 3 with a clearly Australian face, and even Fortescue sells roughly 87% of its iron ore directly to Chinese steel mills. The royalties paid to the Western Australian state government, around 7.5% on the value of iron ore fines, fund hospitals and schools across Perth, but the underlying capital structure means that when iron ore prices spike, the windfall is split between shareholders scattered across 3 continents, a government in Canberra that has spent the last decade trying to figure out how to tax the boom without scaring off the next round of investment. Consider what happened in 2020 and 2021, when diplomatic relations between Beijing and Canberra collapsed over Australia's call for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. China retaliated with tariffs and informal bans on Australian wine, barley, lobster, coal, beef, timber, and cotton. The list was long, deliberate, and economically painful for the affected industries, but iron ore was untouched. Not because Beijing forgot, and not because Canberra negotiated some quiet exemption. It was untouched because there was no alternative. Brazilian production from Vale was still recovering from the Brumadinho Dam collapse in January 2019, which killed 270 people and forced the shutdown of multiple mines. Guinea's Simandou deposit, often described as the largest untapped high-grade iron ore reserve in the world, was still years away from first shipment, tangled in financing disputes, infrastructure gaps, and political instability. African iron ore in 2020 was a promise. Pilbara iron ore was a Tuesday morning shipment, and so Chinese steel mills paid record prices, peaking at $233 US dollars per ton in May 2021 to keep the ore flowing through Port Hedland, regardless of what their diplomats were saying about Australian politicians. That episode taught both sides something uncomfortable. Beijing learned that strategic decoupling from a single commodity supplier is not a policy choice you can announce at a press conference. It is a 15-year infrastructure project requiring deep water ports, dedicated rail lines, mining concessions, processing facilities, and trained workforces in countries that may or may not remain politically friendly across the lifespan of the investment. Canberra learned that resource leverage cuts both ways. The Australian government discovered during that same period that it could not actually weaponize iron ore exports in response to Chinese pressure, because doing so would have detonated its own economy faster than it would have hurt Beijing. The royalties, the mining wages, the construction contracts, the superannuation funds invested in mining stocks, the regional banks, the diesel suppliers, the helicopter charter companies that ferry workers in, out of the Pilbara on 1-2 hour rotations from Perth, all of it depended on the ore continuing to move. Sovereignty, in practice, turned out to be a more complicated thing than the speeches suggested. Walk through Port Hedland itself, and the contradiction becomes physical. The town has a median house price that has swung from $1.2 million Australian dollars at the peak of the 2012 boom to under $350,000 in the 2016 downturn. Then back up again. The South Hedland Shopping Center has a Woolworths, a Kmart, a handful of takeaway shops, and a parking lot that fills with white utility vehicles during shift changes. The red dust gets into everything. Residents have complained for years about air quality, particularly elevated levels of fine particulate matter from ore handling. A 2016 state government report quietly acknowledged that children in West End, the older residential area closest to the stockpiles, had blood lead levels worth monitoring. The response was a buyback scheme for affected homes, which moved families out and turned much of West End into a zone designated for industrial expansion. The town, in other words, has been physically eaten by the thing that funds it. People who grew up there describe a community that has been steadily hollowed out, replaced by fly-in, fly-out workers who spend 2 weeks on, 1 week off, and never put down roots. And yet the wages remain extraordinary. A truck driver hauling ore on a Rio Tinto site can earn $150,000 Australian dollars a year. A skilled maintenance technician on a shutdown crew can clear $200,000. Mining engineers with 10 years of experience command salaries that rival surgeons in Sydney. This is what dependency looks like at the human scale. It is not a story of exploitation in the simple sense, because the workers are paid handsomely. Most of them know exactly what they are trading their time for. It is a story of an entire regional economy organized around a single buyer on the other side of an ocean. A single product loaded onto a single class of vessel, leaving from a single harbor whose tide windows determine the rhythm of the work. The deeper question, the one that economists and strategists in both Canberra and Beijing keep circling without ever quite answering, is what happens in the 2030s. Simandou is now genuinely moving toward first production, with Rio Tinto itself involved as a partner alongside Chinese state firms, in a twist that suggests the major miners have decided that if diversification is inevitable, they would rather own a piece of the replacement than be replaced by it. Chinese scrap steel recycling is growing slowly but measurably, which reduces the marginal demand for virgin iron ore over time. Decarbonization pressures on steel making, particularly the push toward hydrogen-based direct reduction, favor higher-grade ores than the Pilbara typically produces, which could shift the premium toward Brazilian and eventually Guinean material. None of these trends will end Port Hedland's relevance in 5 years or even 10. But layered together across a 20-year horizon, they describe a future in which the single port in the desert is no longer the only port that matters.